Now to begin Chapter 3, Lesson 9. And Chapter 3, Lesson 9 is dealing with distances on the coordinate plane. So we have our coordinate plane, we have quadrants 1, 2, 3, and 4. So I have to look at those numbers, like the positive positive that sets up quadrant 1, or the negative negative sets up quadrant 3. And I have to be able to find the distance if they're on the opposite side of the y-axis, or if they're on the opposite side of the x-axis, or if they're on the same side, they're both in quadrant 1 or they're both in quadrant 4. So we get into a point where we just count little boxes over and over and over again. But sometimes that's going to get really tricky when I get into quadrants, like with our Halloween pictures, where I went to a positive 14 and a negative 14. So I have to begin by being able to look at the information and knowing once again how to plot points. So this tells me that according to where the eagle nest is, that there's two parks that are going to be located on this map. And before I can find out their distances between one another, I have to be able to plot them. So Camp 1 is going to be at -4, 3, and Camp 2 is going to be at 5, 3. So I have to be able to figure out once again how to plot those, and I always follow the same pattern. I'm going to run before I jump. In my parentheses, my first one's always going to be my x, my second one's always going to be my y, and they're always going to be separated by a comma. My first one is x. I'm either going to run forward if it's positive, I'm going to run backwards if it's negative from my 0, my point of origin. And then my second one, my y, is going to tell me to either jump up from my point of origin if it's positive, or I'm going to jump down if it's negative. Well, my first one tells me I'm at -4, 3. So I have to go to my point of origin, and I'm -4, so I have to run backwards to the -4. Now I don't put a point there, once again. I just keep my pencil there until I figure out where my next part goes, because I have to go to both locations in my parentheses before I put the point on my paper. My second number tells me it's +3, so I know I'm going to jump up on my y, and therefore I'm going to go -4, +3, and I'm going to put a point. I found that location on my coordinate plane. My second camp tells me that I'm at 5, 3. So I go back to my point of origin. That's always my beginning. I'm always going to 0. And I'm going to run forward 5, because in my parentheses, that's what my first number, my x, tells me to do. So I go forward 5 on my x-axis, which is horizontal, and then I'm going to jump up 3 on my y-axis, and I put a point. Now the question becomes, well, what is the distance between the two? So I have to notice that there's a point, either my x or my y, that is the same in my coordinates. If my x is the same, but my y is the same, I know that I'm going to be in the same location horizontally, right? If the x is not the same, but the y is, I'm going to be across from each other horizontally. If my x is the same, but my y is different, then I know I'm going to be at the same point vertically, either on the right side of the y-axis or on the left side of the y-axis. But I have to then be able to find my distance between the two. That's where we go back to our previous lesson of absolute value. That's where those two bars are. And it's asking you, well, how many steps do you take from 0 to get to that number? And it really should be the easiest lesson of the entire year, even though some people make it extremely complicated. If I see the words absolute value or the bars that say absolute value, then I just take the number that's on the inside and I make it positive. Because if I'm going forward, I'm still taking steps from 0. If I'm going backwards, I'm still taking steps from 0. So if I'm here at 0 and I take 2 steps forward, I know I took 2 steps, my absolute value was 2. But if I'm here and I take 2 steps backwards, I still took 2 steps from 0. So even though I went -2, I'm still an absolute value of 2. So with that, then I look at this first one is saying which of my coordinates, which of my two axes numbers are the same. Well, I have my y, right? Because they're both +3. So I know my y is the same. That's going to help us in our shortcut to be able to notice that. And I'll teach you the shortcuts to I'm going to add all these boxes here in a couple moments. Then I'm going to look at my other two numbers. So I know that I have a -4. So on my first one, I have -4, and I need to know its absolute value. What is its distance from 0? Once again, Those bars or the words absolute value just tell me to figure out how many steps I took from 0. And that's just the positive number, right? So instead of -4, I know my absolute value is +4 because I went 4 steps backwards. So I know that that one's 4 miles from my point of origin, my 0, 0. Then I have to figure out what my distance is for the second camp. And my second camp tells me that I have 5, 3. So if I look at my point of origin as being 0, what is the distance from 0 to 5? Well, if I go from 5 to 0, then my absolute value of 5 is just 5, right? So I went 5 miles. So I'm 4 miles over here, I'm 5 miles over here. What is the distance between the two? So when I know that I have 5 on my second one, and I go back and I said I had 4 on my first one, since they're on opposite sides of the y-axis, this will apply also if they're on the opposite side of the x-axis. But as long as they're on opposite sides, I'm always going to add. And I have 4 plus 5, basic first grade math, right? That's 9. Now they told me that on this map, each of my units, each of my boxes is worth miles. So I have to have the label. If I don't have the label, then I'm going to be wrong. This is an explanation. Once again, explanation is in words, and some of you still just want to show me a math problem. That's not what it says. It says to explain. You have to be able to tell me in words how you're doing your math, and then it says to show me your work because it says what is the distance. Explain how you could use absolute value to find the distance from camp 2 to the eagle's nest. So what would I do? Well, we're going to find the distance from camp 2 to the x-axis and the distance from the eagle's nest to the x-axis. I got to find the distance going up and the distance going down from the x-axis. Pause the video, write that down before you move on, and don't get frustrated that I'm going to keep teaching. So if I know that's the process I'm going to do, then I just show that work. So I'm going to find the absolute value of the 3, and then I want to find the absolute value of the -2. And once again, I just take the number inside those absolute value bars, and I make it a positive number no matter what. So +3 is just +3. -2 is just +2. So that distance of going 3 and 2, I add them together because I'm on opposite sides of my x-axis. And when I add those together, I would get 5 miles. So let's look at what we're talking about here on your example A. So I have 2 groups of units, and I'm going to be using both of those. The first one, we're on in the same quadrant, right? So we're on the same side of the y, and we're on the same side of the x, and they're horizontal numbers. The second one that we'll get to then is on the same side of the y, same side of the x, both in quadrant 1, and they're now vertical numbers because they line up vertically. So let's look at what it's asking us to do and how we're going to calculate those. This is completely different from what we just did because what we just did was on opposite sides of the y or opposite sides of the x. Now we're on the same side, so I can't do the same math. When I look at these 2 points, the horizontal ones that are in quadrant 3, because they're both negative, negative, then I need to see if one of them is the same. Does the x have the same number or the y have the same number? And when I say same, that means the positive or negative sign also. I can't have a +4 and a -4 and say, yeah, those are the same. They're not the same, right? So when I look at them, a -9 and a -4 in my x, not the same. -6, -6, that's the same. So I have to see that my y coordinates are the same, and that allows me, if my y coordinates the same, to be horizontal points from one another. Now I have to find my absolute values that I'm going to use in my math problem. So when I'm going -9, its absolute value is going to be 9, right? Because it doesn't matter if I'm going forward or backwards, I'm taking 9 steps from 0. And then when I look at the other one, it's -4, so my absolute value is 4. Now if I do the math that we did on the previous ones, the first example, and they were on opposite sides, so if I added these 2 together, I'd end up with 13. And that doesn't make any sense when they're this close together and the numbers go from -10 and -4. I can't have a distance of 13, can I? So this is where I have to think logically about my answers when I'm looking at points and coordinates. Anytime I'm doing math, I got to think logically about my answer. Can this make sense? That one can't make sense if I add those together. So if I'm in the same coordinate, I'm always going to subtract them. That's because if I go forward one step and my friend goes forward 4 steps from the starting line, I'm not going to say, well, I am 5 steps away, because I'm not, because we're both going in the same directions. So I went forward 1, they went forward 4, we subtract them, we were only 3 steps apart. We're in the same coordinate, or the same quadrant, excuse me, then I'm going to subtract them. So when I see that I have 9 and I have 4 in the same quadrant, when I subtract them, then I have 5 units, and that makes much more sense than saying they're 13 units apart. Once again, though, I have to have my units because that's my label. On the first one, it was miles. This doesn't have any labels on it, so I just call it a unit because each box is just a unit of measurement, even though I don't know what that measurement actually is. When I do the second one, then in the top right-hand corner, that's quadrant 1, and I know that if I just looked at the coordinates because they're both positive, positive. They're on the same side in the same quadrant, so that should tell me what we just learned on example A. I'm going to have to subtract those. I have to figure out that when I look at them, my x is the same. And once again, if my x is the same, then that means my 2 points are going to line up vertically. Once again, if my y is the same, then both numbers are going to line up horizontally. So if my x is the same, I don't need it, I get rid of it, and then I just look at my absolute value of the 2 y numbers. On the first one, I have an absolute value of 10, and on my second one, I have an absolute value of 3. So when I look at absolute value of 10, I know it's equal to 10. Absolute value of 3, I know it's equal to 3. They're in the same quadrant, so I know I'm going to subtract them. So when I subtract 10 and 3, I'm going to end up with 7 units. Now, I know that you're going to be aware of this, but we are getting into using positive and negative numbers. If I happen to line it up as 3 minus 10, I don't want to come up with a negative number in these answers. So I'm just going to put the 10 in front and subtract the 3, because this isn't an adding and subtracting integers math lesson. This is getting a whole number for a measurement in units. So 10 minus 3 is 7, so I know my answer is 7. And units, once again, any label adds an extra point that your question is worth. If I showed the work, I got the right answer, but I don't put the label of units, then I'm only going to get a 66% for that question. There's no reason to get a 66% when I can just simply write down the label and get 100. All right, so here are our practice questions. That's a quick lesson, but I'm also going to make it easier. I'm going to give you some shortcuts to write down after we do this first one. I'm going to ask you to pause once I show it to you and make sure that these are written down on your paper. I would suggest you also write them down on your homework assignment so you remember what these shortcut steps are. When I start by looking at these, then it tells me I need to find these points of negative 3, 1 and 2, 1. So here's negative 3, 1, here's 2, 1. They're in different quadrants, so that should tell me in my head, I know I'm going to have to add those together. So I start by trying to figure out which of their coordinate is the same. And I see that the y is the same. And once again, if the y is the same, then they're going to line up horizontally from one another. So when I see which one is the same, then I'm just going to get rid of it. I don't need that one. So I'm going to get rid of the ones, and that way I can just focus on the numbers I am using, which is a negative 3 and a positive 2. And so I have to find my absolute value of those numbers. So I have an absolute value of 3. How many steps from 0 did I go? 3. So it's just a positive 3. And I have an absolute value of 2. How many steps from 0 did I go? Just 2. So it's always going to be a positive 2. And then because they're on opposite sides of the y-axis, I know I have to add their distances. So I have 3 plus 2, which is going to give me a total of 5. But I'm not done, am I? Have to have a label. Does it tell me what unit measurement I'm using here? It doesn't, so I'm just going to put units. All right, so now here's the shortcut. Now I want you to make sure these are written down. First, you make sure that this step is written down right here. This is always going to be your first step. Get rid of the same axis number. If the x's are the same, I cross them out. If the y's are the same, I cross them out. That way I don't get confused on what I'm using. The two processes then that you're going to write down, and I don't care where you write them, but I would make sure that I write them. You're making tracks in this note. Do as I'm asking you to do, because this is one of the things I'm going to check when I collect your math books at the end of this 9 weeks. Actually, I'll collect them for the midterms. So I'm looking for my opposite signs. So if I have opposite signs, if they are across the y-axis, if they're across the x-axis, I have a positive and a negative, or a negative and a positive, that I'm always going to add the absolute values. Once again, those bars mean the absolute value of the numbers. If they're the same sign, they're both negative or they're both positive, I'm going to subtract their absolute values. So this says add absolute values, subtract absolute values. Write those down in your book now. Pause the video as I move on and then come back. So I'm going to go through those 3 steps every single time. It's actually 2 steps. I just have to recognize which of these 2 I'm using. My first step is always get rid of the same axis number. I have a positive 2 and a positive 2. Those are definitely the same. So I'm going to cross those out. Then I just check. Are my y's different? They are. I've got a positive 1 and a negative 4. So now I find the absolute values of my y's. Well, my absolute value of 1 and my absolute value of 4 tells me that I'm going to have 1 plus 4, and I know I'm adding because I have opposite signs, and opposite signs tell me to add their absolute values. Well, 1 plus 4, first grade math, right? 4 plus 1, 5. So I have 5, but get that extra point. 5 what? 5 units. All of these are going to have a label of units unless they specify what my unit is. All right, so I go to 3. Get rid of the same axis number. I have a 2 and a 4 for my x. That's not the same. Negative 4, that's the same. So now I'm going to cross out my y's. So I'm left with 2 and 4. So I'm going to find my absolute values of 2 and 4, 2 and 4. And then it tells me that if they are the same signs, I'm going to subtract them. So these I have to subtract. So I'm not going to take 2 minus 4, so I'm just going to switch those around. I'm going to put 4 minus 2, first and second grade math, right? So 4 minus 2 gives me 2, and I always put my label of units. I do the same thing on number 4. Get rid of the same axis number. I have a negative 3 and a negative 3 in my x. I get rid of them, I cross them out. Then I look for my absolute values. I have a 3 and a 1, both positive. So I know I'm going to have on the same side, right? Same signs. So now I'm going to subtract those as well. So 3 minus 1, 3 minus 1, I end up with 2, but I add my label of units. This should make it a whole lot easier than having to count boxes. That's the goal of this lesson, is to teach you this shortcut. So once again, I remember these steps, and I remember it always starts with finding the axis that is the same and getting rid of it. 0 and 0 are the same for my x's, so I get rid of them. I have 5 and 5. Don't think, oh, those are the same. They're not the same. They have the same absolute value, but a 5 and a negative 5 are completely different numbers. So I'm going to find their absolute values, and since they are opposite signs, I'm going to add their absolute values together. 5 plus 5, basic math, is 10 units, right? Don't forget the label. Go to 6. In my x, I have positive 1s again, so I'm going to get rid of the x again, and now I have a 1 and a negative 3. I find their absolute value, and I see that they're opposites. Opposite signs add their absolute values, so 1 plus 3 is going to give me 4 units. All right, number 7. I have negative, I've got my x-axis, that's the same again. So I'm going to get rid of my x-axis, and then I'm going to look at negative 5 and negative 1 and find their absolute values. Those are the same signs, right? So same signs tell me now I'm going to subtract. So I'm going to take 5 minus 1. Once again, if you line them up differently, 1 minus 5 gives us a negative number, and we're not dealing with integers when it comes to calculations here. But I always want to end up with a positive number for my distance between my points. So I'm going to get 4 units. All right, so I want you to do the next 3 on your own. Pause the video, make sure these steps are written down. It'll make your life a lot easier, and then come back to me when you're done. So I'm hoping you did what I asked. You've actually done the work and you've got your answers, and now I'm going to walk you through it and make sure you got the right answers. So I go back to my first step, get rid of the same axis number. My x's are opposites, right? They're not even the same digit. So my y's, those are the same. So I get rid of my y's. That leaves me with a -7 and a -5. I should clue in real quick. Those are opposites. So I know I'm going to add their absolute values. So I find their absolute values. Absolute value of -7, absolute value of 5. I'm going to add them together since I have a negative and a positive. 7 plus 5, you should have gotten 12 units. If you didn't write units, you missed a point. So make sure you write down units in your examples here. I go to 9. What's the same? Well, my x's are the same on this one, so I'm going to get rid of those. And then you should have said, well, I'm going to find my absolute values, and you should have said, oh, those are the same, so I know I'm going to subtract them. So I know I'm going to find the absolute value of -6, the absolute value of -10, and then you switch the order of them because you have to come up with a positive distance between your points. And 10 minus 6 gave you 4 units. And then you did this one where it was 8 in the x's, so you cross those out, and then you had 0 and -8. Now 0 is considered neither positive or negative, right? But when I do these, I just like to say, well, it's just a positive number. So I say that this is opposite of one another, so I'm going to add. It's really not going to make any difference if you say they're opposite as long as you take 8 minus 0, not 0 minus 8. Okay? But you're going to end up, or should have ended up, with 8 units. All right, the last type of problems you're going to be given is, here are your coordinates. This is the distance I want you to go. Now, there are two answers that you could come up with on every one of these. And as long as one of your answers is accurate and correct, I don't care which one you come up with. I always write the same or both options down on my answer sheet when I make these. So you do whichever one works best for you. But I still go through my same steps of knowing which way I'm going to go. So when I have 4 units from 3, 5, I have to know what my x and my y is that I'm looking at. My second number is always my y. So I'm looking at 5. I'm going to get rid of the 3. That way it doesn't confuse me. So I know I'm 4 units. So that could be that I'm adding 4, but it could also be that I'm subtracting 4. So I'm either going to go up by 4 from the 5, or I'm going to go down 4 from the 5. And I don't care which way you go. So if I know that I have a 5, then I can take 5 plus 4, and that's going to give me 9. So my ordered pair becomes 3, 9. But I have a second one I can do also. I could be subtracting. I could go down from my 5 on the y-axis. So I have the other option available to you also, and I don't care which way you go. But you would take 5 minus 4 to give you a positive 1 for your y-coordinate. So you could have either one. You don't need to have both. You must have one that is correct, though. When I go to 12, then I see that my x, once again in my ordered pair, my x is always my first number. My x is the one I'm trying to find, so I'm going to cross out my y so it doesn't confuse me. And I know I'm going 6 units. So once again, I can either add or subtract, and I don't care which way you go. If I'm adding 6 or I'm subtracting 6, right? So if I go forward from the 2, 6, I'm adding 6, so I know I'm going to go from positive 2 to positive 8. So one of my ordered pairs could be 8, 1. Now we haven't really gotten into subtracting with integers yet. We will get into that in the next chapter. But if I am starting at 2 on a number line and I'm subtracting 6 from it, so if I look at where the 2 is, then I'm just going backwards 6 steps. And if I go backwards 6 steps, where does that take me? It takes me to a -4, right? If you don't know how to do this mathematically, if that doesn't make sense to you, if you want to draw a number line, you can, but keep in mind, you don't have to do the negative. All you have to have is the positive that's correct, and it still counts. But if I want to do that one, then I end up with -4. So my other point could be -4, 1. Once again, there were 2 possible options. Both are correct, and I don't care which one you do. So I want you to try number 13 on your own. Pause the video and come back with me, and we'll check your work. Hopefully you did what I asked. You paused it and you worked it and you have an answer. So let's check what we did. So if I know I'm going to go 7 units from -4, -1, and it's the y that we're looking for, you cross out the x so you don't get confused, right? So I'm going to go 7. I could add 7 or I could subtract 7. So if I added 7 on my -1 plus 7, well, if I did my number line, I had -1 and I went forward 7, then I would get to +6. So an ordered pair that I could have is -4, +6. If I wanted to subtract, which is my second option, then I have to know how I subtract on a number line, how I subtract integers. Well, on my number line, if I go to -1 and I subtract, so I know I'm going to go backwards still in my negative numbers, 7 different times, where does that take me? Well, that takes me to -8. But what we're going to learn when we do math with integers is that I can never subtract integers, and I have to change it into an addition problem. So we haven't taught that yet, but you can figure that out by doing the number line. And all of these are going to be pretty easy numbers to use. But I'll show you how to switch this up and how to change it. But I'm still going to get to the -8. So one of your options, you either should have gotten -4, +6 for your ordered pair, or -4, -8 for your ordered pair. That's the lesson. All right, so look at my board, figure out what your assignment is. This should be easy, but once again, if you don't get it, if you're kind of lost, you're kind of confused, please come and ask. There's not very many of you asking me questions, and some of our grades have gone down. I'm here to help you learn, and I'll reteach it to you so that you can get an A. Have a good one.